Howdy folks, hope you all had a good weekend and welcome to another episode of Mingles with Jingles. So the Elite Odyssey Alpha Test Phase 4 began this week, and honestly, I installed it, I logged in, I took a quick look, and I really couldn't be bothered because there isn't really anything new in the fourth phase of the Alpha, other than the ability to use your existing commander from the live server, snapshotted and imported into the Alpha Test server. So other than marvelling at just exactly how absolutely massive a ship like the Anaconda is, there wasn't really anything new to see. And it turns out that the Odyssey alpha test wasn't really an alpha test in the way that we're all used to, because there's going to be no beta test, and the actual game is going to be available for purchase on the 19th of May. So it turns out what we were actually playing wasn't really an alpha, although they were using it to test various different systems. But it was more of a prototype version of the game engine that Frontier Developments were still working on while we were all playing the alpha. If that makes sense. It's like they got to a certain stage of development when they were prototyping Odyssey, and then they froze it and said, right, that's going to be the alpha test, and then continued work. But what we were seeing during the alpha, this prototype version of the full game, didn't include a lot of things, in particular visuals, such as the, well, things that you're looking at now. And I have to admit, this does kind of explain a number of things, because how can I put this? I enjoyed playing through the various different phases of the alpha test. Even though it wasn't really an alpha test, it was more of an extended game demo, despite the fact that they were taking feedback and introducing changes based on player feedback. But one of the things in particular that I did find a little disappointing when I was playing through the, okay, we'll just call it an alpha, was the lack of variation in the atmospheric effects that were available on the various different planets that did have tenuous atmospheres. While they were very, very pretty, they were all the same. And I was expecting a huge range of different effects, that no matter how hard I tried or how far off the beaten path I tried to go to explore, all of those planets that did have tenuous atmospheres, while they were very pretty, they all pretty much looked kind of the same. There were only really two variations, hot planets or cold planets, and that was it. The light from the various different colours and types of stars in those systems didn't seem to make any real difference to the lighting effects, and that was kind of disappointing. But it turns out that there was only one atmosphere/lighting effect in the alpha test. In the full release of the game that comes out on the 19th of May, well, just take a look at these screenshots. There are all kinds of different atmospheric lighting effects. But in the alpha, there was only the one, which is why everything kind of looked very, very similar. Which was a bit disappointing, but on the other hand, it's quite encouraging to know that that was purely a limitation of the alpha test, and a huge range of different visuals, as promised, are going to be available when the game sees its full release on the 19th of May. So I'm still looking forward to this, even if it'll almost certainly just end up being another massive grind to unlock and upgrade the various different engineers who are going to be providing the same services to ground weapons and suits as the existing engineers in the game did to ships and ship equipment. And you either like that sort of thing or you don't. And I do. I mean, obviously, I still play World of Warcraft. Clearly, I love the grind. But I am definitely going to be sinking my teeth into Elite once again when the Odyssey expansion goes live on the 19th of May. Whether or not I can find anything interesting enough to do to bother putting into a YouTube video, of course, is an entirely different matter. I guess we'll just have to wait and see. While we're on the subject of World of Warcraft, well, not World of Warcraft specifically, but something that I noticed while playing World of Warcraft that we talked about in last week's video. The basic lack of common social decency in massively multiplayer online games. And we're not talking here about somebody going out of their way to be a dick to you in something like World of Tanks or League of Legends, Call of Duty. I mean, that's pretty much par for the course. It's more unusual when you're playing those kind of games for people to be nice than to be a complete nutter dick. Now, I'm talking about games where you don't necessarily have to interact with other players, even though there are other players in them. Games like World of Warcraft. And in last week's episode, I pointed out that Well, call me a Care Bear if you will, but if I'm playing something like World of Warcraft and I come across another player who might be in trouble, they might have bitten off a little bit more than they can chew, providing it's not going to unduly inconvenience me, more often than not, I'll stop and help. Or if I'm playing a character class that can buff other players, providing I'm on foot anyway, because in order to cast a buff spell you have to dismount, so if I'm on the way from A to B I probably won't do it, but if I'm dismounted anyway, and there are other players nearby who would benefit from the buff, I'll buff them. And last week I pointed out that I don't do this for thanks, I do it because I can, it doesn't cost me anything, or very little, and it's a beneficial service to other players. But I also pointed out just how extremely rare it is for another player to take the time to even as much as say thank you for it. Now, a couple of people pointed out, and they're absolutely correct, that sometimes people just don't want to be helped. And that's fair enough. But there's another category of player out there. And this is the kind of player who just can't be helped, no matter how hard you try. Because I was reading through the comments of last week's Mingles with Jingles, and it reminded me of something that happened years and years and years ago while playing World of Warcraft. Now, World of Warcraft is actually a pretty good example for the sort of thing that I'm going to talk about here, because it's the kind of game that just isn't hard at all. That's not to say that there aren't things that you can do in World of Warcraft that are very hard, but generally speaking, it's a very, very simple and forgiving game. It's one of the main reasons behind its popularity. But that doesn't mean that there aren't people out there who just are never even going to get World of Warcraft. Right? And a couple of years ago, in this one particular incident, I met one of them and tried so very hard to help them. But, well, it just wasn't possible. So at the time, I'm on my mage character. Her name is Callie, and I'm hanging around in Stormwind, making money, putting enchantments on other people's gear. One of Callie's side professions was enchanter. This allows her to put beneficial spell effects permanently on your stuff. So I'm paying attention to trade chat, and I saw somebody asking for a Demon Slayer enchant, and I could do this. So I invited him to a group, so I could find him, and then I met him outside the auction house, and, well, this is kind of where it started. So he wanted a Demon Slayer enchant, which is an enchant that increases your attack power when you're fighting demons. It's not a useless enchant, except this guy was a mage, like Callie. And attack power, as a stat, is 100% useless to mages. Mages are spellcasters, right? They want stats like intellect and spell power and things like that. They don't want attack power. That's a melee DPS character stat, or it was at the time. This was back in vanilla World of Warcraft. So I asked him, why is it that you want a Demon Slayer enchant? He said, well, it's got a cool glow on it. And yeah, it's true, the Demon Slayer enchant did look very cool on a weapon. And I couldn't really criticise him for that. Because I'd done exactly the same thing on my Hunter several months earlier. I knew that I wasn't going to get an awful lot of use out of the Demon Slayer enchant on my Hunter's melee weapon, but the Hunter never used the melee weapon anyway, and it just looked kind of cool, stuck on his back, all nice and glowy. So, fair enough. But while I was there, I inspected this guy, and I took a look at his gear, and oh my god. He clearly didn't have a clue. I'm not going to break this down into how a mage should itemise their gear, but just take my word for it. He didn't have a clue. Everything he was wearing was wrong. So I thought, you know what, I can do some good here. And one of Callie's other professions was tailor, which allows her to make cloth armour, which is what mages wear. And I had a whole bunch of low-level cloth that I had no real use for. So I said, hang on a minute. And I started making him a full set of useful cloth armour that would directly benefit this guy. And in fact, I felt so sorry for him, I even went into the auction house and bought some useful rings, necklace, weapons, you know, the stuff that I couldn't make, I went into the auction house and bought for him. I felt that bad for him. And then I enchanted all of it out of my own pocket. I didn't actually charge him anything for this, with enchants that would actually be useful for a mage, and then I handed it all over. And you know what his reaction was? But I wanted a Demon Slayer enchant. Now, on the one hand, and I know what you're thinking, look, if the guy wants a Demon Slayer enchant, sell him a Demon Slayer enchant. And yeah, I could have done just that. I could have ripped him off. No, Jingles, you don't understand. Maybe he knew that it was, like your hunter, maybe he knew it wasn't really beneficial, but he just wanted a Demon Slayer enchant because it had a cool glow. Well, yes, he did want the Demon Slayer enchant because he'd seen other people with it, and he said, "Ooh, that looks really nice. What's that?" They said, "A Demon Slayer enchant," so he tried to get one. And so, yes, he did want it because it looked cool, but he didn't know that it wasn't beneficial for him. And even after I had explained why it wasn't beneficial for him and pointed out the terrible crap he was wearing and how much better the stuff that I'd made and bought for him would be, even after he'd admitted that yes, he was finding it a real struggle to advance in levels, and I'd pointed out to him it was because of the garbage that he was wearing and the way that he'd itemized all of his gear. But even after I'd pointed all of this out to him and explained that this was exactly the reason why he was finding it such a struggle to play a mage, he didn't want any of the gear. He took it off me, he put it all on, and then he sort of stood there and looked at himself. And then I saw him start to put all of his old stuff back on, all of the garbage, because he just preferred the way it looked. And you know, that's absolutely fine. I am forced to admit that completely horrible and inefficient though his gear choices may have been, that's his choice. If he chose to wear stuff based purely on the aesthetics, on how good it looked to him, even if that meant that as a spellcasting DPS class he was doing really shit spellcasting DPS, it's his character, he can play it however he likes. Up to a point. I mean, they say you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. But if the horse doesn't want to drink, well, that's the horse's choice. Up to a point. Several months later, I noticed that I, purely by accident, just happened to see him in a city and thought, oh, I remember this guy. And sure enough, his gear choices hadn't improved at all. But one thing that was new was that I noticed that he was suddenly sporting a guild tag. He'd been accepted into a guild. Not a particularly prominent guild on the server, but not a bad guild. I knew some of them. They were nice people. This guy lasted precisely one raid. They took him into the Molten Core raid dungeon on a sort of trial. His damage output was absolutely terrible. As I predicted. And when the bosses were being killed and the loot was dropping, he was bidding on gear that was no use whatsoever to a mage, but he wanted just because, yep, he liked the look of it. I think the loot in question, and again, I realise I'm getting down into the weeds here, but for those of you who did play World of Warcraft back in vanilla, let me just say that when the Perdition's blade drops in Molten Core and one of the mages starts rolling on it, I'm not sure I can really think of a way to put that into context for people who haven't played World of Warcraft and don't understand the rank stupidity on display here. Suffice to say, he didn't last long with that guild. And I never really heard from him again, or of him again. Like I say, I mean, you can try to help, but some people just cannot be helped. That's just the way the cookie crumbles. Of course, you can look at it from the other side of the coin as well, and for this I'm going to use another example, and again it's from World of Warcraft. So, this was at the end of the Wrath of the Lich King expansion. Again, I'm not going to go into details, but suffice to say, that at the end of the expansion, most players did not need the loot from regular dungeons. The sort of dungeons that people were running at the start of the expansion. Most players completely outgeared them. There was no useful loot drops in them whatsoever. This created a problem, because new players, even at the end of the expansion, still needed to get gear from dungeons. But most players didn't want to run these dungeons because there was nothing useful in there for them. To fix this problem, Blizzard came up with a fairly ingenious idea. Even though you didn't need any of the loot from the dungeons, each dungeon boss would drop a token, and you could use those tokens to buy loot that was useful for you. So all kinds of horribly overgeared players were queuing up for these dungeons that they didn't actually need any loot from. They were only doing it for the tokens, and that's fine. Most of the time, the dungeon groups that you would get would be horribly overgeared players, and the dungeon would be over in 15 minutes. They would just storm through it. If you were the healer, you had very little to do, because the player who was tanking just wasn't taking any damage. You'd blitz through the whole thing in 15 minutes, everybody would get their tokens at the end of it, everybody would be happy. But maybe 5% of the time, the group finder would put you into the dungeon with a tank who actually needed the loot from the dungeon. Somebody who had only just reached the level cap and were doing these dungeons for the first time. And it was here where you would meet the most repellent scum the human race has to offer. Most of the time, under these circumstances, what would tend to happen is whoever was healing would take one look at this noob tank with maybe 24,000 health, rather than your typical overgeared tank with 50,000 health, and the healer would just quit the group. Because, you know, healing somebody who's perfectly adequately geared for the dungeon in which they find themselves is just too much like hard work, isn't it? If by some miracle the healer didn't quit the group, then 1, 2, or all 3 of the DPS classes would, and if that didn't happen, somebody would initiate a vote to kick the noob tank from the group. To put all of this into perspective for you, people would rather quit the existing group and get a deserter debuff, which would mean that they couldn't use the group finder tool for another 30 minutes, then go through the whole process of queuing up for a dungeon again, waiting for a healer, waiting for another tank, basically committing themselves to wasting an hour of their life trying to get a different group with an overgeared tank, rather than just cracking on, taking the tank that they have, who is, and let's be 100% clear about this, perfectly adequately geared for the content in which they find themselves. How is this poor bastard noob tank supposed to get to the level where DPS and healers are going to condescend to allow them to tank for them if everyone runs a mile rather than spend an extra 15 fucking minutes taking things at the pace they were intended? Quite apart from the whole not being a failure of humanity thing, do they think that there were so many tanks around looking for groups that they could afford to be choosy? Do you want to ensure that this one never makes it into the tanking pool after having their enthusiasm crushed by your being a selfish prick, more concerned about shaving 15 minutes off the next soulless badge farming session than being a decent human being? My warrior tank, who went by the name of Gorn, was doing these instances with 24,000 health after being buffed when he hit level 80. These pricks wanted to kick this tank for having 24,000 health before being buffed. Technically, she was actually slightly overgeared for the dungeon, and these cocksuckers wanted to kick her because she wasn't overgeared enough. Well, I've got news for you, Pandeos. Not when I'm the fucking healer, you don't. At the time, I was on my priest, Alluriel. Alluriel, like the 3 DPS classes in this terrible group, was hopelessly overgeared for this dungeon. She didn't require any of the loot drops. She was only in it for the tokens. The tank, by the way, she already got brownie points in my book because all of her gear was gemmed and it was enchanted. She'd actually invested a whole lot of gold, effort and research into gear that she was probably only actually going to be using for maybe 3 days, before she'd gathered upgrades for it. But she'd put the time and the effort into turning up prepared. And the DPS still wanted to get rid of her and take their chances waiting 20 to 40 minutes for another tank. Oh no. No. Not when I'm the healer. And you know what the first thing this tank said when she zoned into this instance to see us all standing there? Right before the DPS started a vote to kick her from the group? And I'm quoting here, "Sorry for my bad English. I try to be good tank. We have fun, yes?" And right there, the hunter started the vote to kick her from the group. I honestly and sincerely hope that the person playing that hunter dies in a fire before they get the opportunity to teach their values to children. That hunter and one of the other DPS, I think it was a warlock, quit the group when I refused to go along with the vote kick. That's fine, I told them both. The tank stays or I leave. And they made their choice. Fuck them both. Enjoy your deserter buff and re-queue time, pricks. You know something else? Healing was a bit of a challenge, but no more a challenge than trying to keep some idiot DPS alive with no concept of personal threat control. And, well, I did that on every other dungeon, so what's the difference? The tank maintained aggro on multiple bad guys, never once let me come under threat, taunted off when the DPS opened up too early, didn't die, and we cleared the instance in the regular time. And at the end, actually apologised for her poor English and bad tanking gear. She was skilled, competent, talented, multilingual, and humble. She was a great tank. The DPS? Not so much. I like to think I'm a fairly easygoing kind of guy. I mean, I'm 51 years old now. There's very little that actually gets me excited anymore. But this sort of thing really pushes my buttons. Anyway, moving on swiftly. So, as quarantine restrictions start to lift here in the UK, the Tank Museum at Bovington is starting to gear up again. I'm very happy to be able to report that the Tank Museum is going to be reopening to visitors on the 17th of May, tickets for which will be available online from the 11th of May. Also, Tankfest and Tiger Day tickets are back on sale. Tankfest 2021 is going to take place between the 17th and the 20th of September. All 4 days tickets are now available, same with Tiger Day 15. And finally, the new World War II exhibition at the Tank Museum, which was supposed to be open last year but for obvious reasons couldn't, at 11 AM on the 13th of May, 4 days before the physical reopening of the Tank Museum, they're going to be doing a virtual opening. Head over to the Tank Museum website, check out the details, and you too can view the opening of the Tank Museum's new World War II exhibition. And I think that's about it for this week's episode of Mingles with Jingles. Hope you've enjoyed it, rant included, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.